Life Management Science Labs would like to acknowledge that we live and produce this podcast on the traditional lands of the Wurundjeri people. We'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands of our listeners and our international colleagues. We'd like to pay our respects to their elders past, present, and emerging. Hello everyone, and welcome to Wealth Pathways, the Affluence Science Insights Podcast produced by LMSL, the Life Management Science Labs. We are champions of life management science, providing structured insights informed by science and inspired by practice on key aspects of conscious living. Each week, we bring you scientific and practical insights on each element with the expert knowledge of professionals in the field. I'm your host, Marie Stella, coming to your ears from Nam, Melbourne, Australia. Let's learn together.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the show. I'm your host, Sabrina Oktavelia. Good leadership is key to achieving success in the project, team, and workplace. In a world that's evolving faster than ever, both employees and leaders are finding that adaptability and flexibility are not just buzzwords. They're essential for fostering innovation, retaining talent, and achieving long-term success. As a generation, we are moving to a dynamic age where rigid schedules and a one-size-fits-all approach were the gold standard for productivity and achievement are no longer viable. So in this episode, we'll explore the conceptions of flexibility and adaptability as a leader. Whether you're a seasoned leader, an aspiring manager, or simply curious about the future of work, this conversation is for you. Guiding us through is Ruchi Sinha, an organizational psychologist and associate professor in the Leadership, Management, and Organization Department at Nanyang Business School, who specializes in teaching negotiation skills and leadership development. She also has a master's degree and PhD in industrial organizational psychology from Michigan State University, USA. We're incredibly fortunate to have her here with us today. Welcome, Ruchi.
Thank you for having me here, Sabrina.
Yeah, thank you. And you are very much welcome to the show. Can you tell us a little bit about your background and what sparked your interest in the topic?
Yeah, so as you mentioned, my educational background is in a field called organizational psychology, which is basically a subdiscipline within psychology that looks at how behavior, emotions, thoughts emerge at workplaces and how they emerge within employees, between relationships, and how does that all lead to an emergence of a climate culture at an organizational level. So I have long studied interpersonal relationships at work. My PhD was actually looking at conflict and how trust gets broken and how do you repair trust in relationships. As I progressed in my academic career, I've worked for business schools. I've taught a lot of executives and MBAs, and there was always this thing that they wanted to know. They wanted to know how to influence people, how to negotiate in ways that they get win-win solutions, how to motivate their teams. So a lot of my work started going from, two people's relationship to a relationship between members in a team. And that's when I realized that so much of what happens in teams is influenced by the person who has the formal authority, which is often the leader. But sometimes the leader doesn't play the role of a good leader, and the team itself starts sharing those leadership qualities. So my interest came more from my interactions with executives and my own understanding of team dynamics and the influence of leaders.
I see. After meeting executives, C-level management types, and the teams themselves, what types of situations require these leaders to be flexible and adaptable?
Yeah, so a whole host of things. Even before a team gets into the implementation or the planning or the implementation stage on a project, leaders define the scope of the problem. They define what is the challenge that they need to solve. And so how you see a challenge is part of being a good adaptive leader. How do you define and create a situational awareness for the team to understand the problem before you start going into solution? Is adaptability in terms of being adaptive. And then the flexibility aspect, because you asked that question, is how do you then adjust your course while you're solving maybe a problem that's very, new or novel and doesn't have a fixed solution. So there are a whole host of things. And the one thing that I focused in a lot recently is voice. How do you enable the safety for people to voice ideas so that you can be adapting the course or being flexible?
I see. So utilizing how the voice and the tones goes and how we can be more flexible and adaptable in that sense. Okay, now that's a really great preface to our topic of the day. But before we continue into the details and the nitty-gritty of today's topic, we are going to go and we'd like to get to know you better. So this is a segment we call, this is Have You Met Ruchi? So, Ruchi, what is your favorite book?
Yeah. These questions came to me before, so I don't have to think about it. But I love the book called Sophie's World. And it's a book I believe everyone in this world should read. Maybe by the time they're 14. So if you have kids, they're ready to read it around 14. It's basically a book about the history of philosophy, but it's embedded into a mystery narrative. So it's a beautiful book because it talks everything from like Aristotle, Socrates, deep philosophy, but in a very fun way, which is a letter written from a philosopher to a 13-year-old girl. So, and what I love about the book is that, it reminds you that we all as humans have asked these basic questions. What's the meaning of life? Why are we here? How are we supposed to live? But the book does an excellent job reflecting on these questions. And I read it all like once every 2 or 3 years, again and again. Yeah, it's that kind of book.
Oh, it's a book that you go back and reread it again and again. That's really good. What about movies? Do you have any movies that you have enjoyed recently?
More than movies, I have to say that I'm loving the Squid Game series. I know this is going to sound a little crazy. It is violent. It's got a lot of gore, but that's not what I love about it. What I think, as a psychologist, I think Squid Game is a fascinating thriller, a psychological thriller that gets to the core of who we are as human beings. What makes us desperate? How do we empathize? How do we manage what we want for ourselves and what we need to do for others to survive? So for me as a psychologist, it's a show that that I love watching, and I think it's very deep, far more deep than the violence and the game that it is about.
Yeah, is the layers deeper than the violence that are shown in the TVs. And what about any podcast? Are you listening to any podcast at the moment?
Yes, I am obsessed with podcasts, so I do listen to a lot of them. But the one I thought of, which I've been listening for quite a few years, and I'm a regular listener, is one called Hidden Brain. Hidden Brain.
Yeah.
Yeah. And again, it's very much touches upon psychological concepts, but I love listening to it because it's just the way the host and the guests talk about things that I know conceptually, but in terms of stories and in terms of what's the most recent, manifestation of those concepts. So it's very thought-provoking, it's very relatable, easy to listen to, but extremely insightful. So I highly recommend it.
Okay, The Hidden Brain. And do you have any role model that you look up to?
Yeah, I was thinking about that when you asked me to think about it. And I'm not someone who often has one role model. Like I tend to look at qualities in different people. But if there was one, I would say it would be my dad, and who's still around. And he is someone who has mastered the art of non-doing in terms of being patient and not getting into the rat race and the busyness. He is extremely well read. He's mature. And I like that quiet strength about him.
Wow. Your dad must be an amazing person to have inspired you to become such a leader, such a researcher that become someone who is prominent. Okay. And next question, is there a course that has inspired you?
Yes. This is the one I'm still doing. It's almost a 1-year course on coaching. So it's to get the International Coaching Federation accreditation. It's many, many hours. But I went in quite a skeptic, thinking coaching is not something that really works, and I don't understand why would someone go to a coach. So as to be very honest, I signed up for it more with a skeptical mindset. I'm almost at the end of like 200 hours of both learning and practicing, and doing a lot of coaching on the side. And I see how much it has borrowed from psychology and psychotherapy and good principles of helping people shift mindsets rather than knowing what the solution is. Or it's not like therapy where you kind of label people with, certain symptoms. It's just about working with another person through their challenges and relying on their insights to come up with their own solutions. So I have found that course to be quite enlightening.
I see. So it's more of a one-on-one personalized sessions that can help you coach them better, coach your students better.
Absolutely.
Okay. Now that's a really wonderful section of Have You Met Ruchi? Now you can get into the nitty-gritty, into the deep to our topic, adaptive leadership and the future of work. So Ruchi, for starters, how would you define affluence?
Yeah, I figured that was sort of the lab in which we're talking today.
Indeed.
And affluence, when you first say the word to me, it just sounds like abundance. And it, to me, initially, as someone from India, it has a little negative tone because it was about wealth and material. But to be honest, affluence is just any resource that you value, that you have in abundance. So I think if I value time or wealth or material comfort, when I feel like I have it in abundance, to me, that is affluence.
I see.
I think that's what I see.
I feel like it's also similar with the word financial freedom because it not only provides you with materialistic needs, but also the freedom of time, and you can choose whatever you want to do with that time. So in that case, it's abundance of time. And secondarily, how would you define leadership?
Yeah, this is something that I do a lot in both my teaching and my consulting. Is it's one of the most ill-defined words, and there are all sorts of things where you end up defining leadership by what the qualities of the leader are, which is not what leadership is. For me, leadership and how it's defined in academic research is that it's a process. It's a process of influence where it could be one person or a set of people or a group. But it's the process of influencing, guiding, motivating, mobilizing either one person or a group of people towards a shared goal. So leadership is the process of influencing people, individuals, and groups towards a shared goal.
I see. So it's more to influencing and being someone who is directing those kind of people to the direction that the company wants. Okay.
Yeah. So directing is one type of influence, right? You can direct them by instructing, or you can empower them, or you can enable them. And they're all different types of influence.
I see. So how would you describe the relationship, right, between leadership and affluence?
I think the way I see it is affluence is a desired human goal. It's desired by individuals, it's desired by teams, by organizations. People would love to have an abundance of things they desire, the resources, whether it's time, material, financial freedom, or meeting your budgets at work, or whatever be the goals. And leadership is about the process of influence towards shared goals. So if affluence is the shared goal, then leadership then becomes the force that will enable people to achieve that shared goal.
I see. And coming to our topic, what does adaptive leadership what does adaptive leadership mean?
Yeah, so this is one of those terms again that have been used in mainstream and in research very differently. In fact, me and my colleagues and co-authors are very close to completing a whole review of the research done on adaptive leadership and how messy it can be. But for me, from having done that work with my colleagues, it's basically, again, it's a process of influence. So in that process of influence, adaptive leadership are some intentional behaviors that a leader does to first understand what it is that the problem is, to diagnose it, and then to think about, given the nature of the issues or the nature of the challenge, what do I need to motivate, mobilize people? And instead of doing it or just instructing, it's about enabling. It's like acting like a musical conductor, adjusting the pitch, the tone, putting somebody on the first chair, somebody on the second chair. And it's actually the fact that you are constantly readjusting your path, adapting yourself, is what makes adaptive leadership extremely important.
I see. I love the analogy of the musical conductor because it gives us an image of these diverse amount of instruments and this diverse people as well that has different skills needed to make a singular song and to make a whole orchestra. So we can have an idea as people who are not maybe in the leadership roles yet on how leaders work. And how do one differentiate adaptability, flexibility, and agility as buzzwords?
Yeah, they do get used interchangeably a lot. And, there are different sorts of methodologies of agile, teamwork. Flexibility is often used in context of flexible work.
Yeah.
So, you have flexibility of time, space, and location. But in the context of leadership, I think the easiest one to differentiate is agility. So agility is the speed and efficiency with which one pivots. So, okay, this is not working. Let's do this. This is not working. Let's do that. So agility is more about the speed and pace of changing paths. Flexibility is about whether you're rigid about the path that you had planned. Do you just use agility to shift between planned, stable paths? Or are you flexible to come up with a brand new path? Are you flexible to bend the rules? Are you bend the rules not illegally, but to reshape them for your purpose? And adaptability may or may not have agility. Like adaptive leadership could be quick, but it could also be over a long period of time. It could have flexibility sometimes, but it could have rigidity and stability based on the challenge. So adaptability is less about saying flexibility and agility is always the thing to do. Adaptability is actually figuring whether stability or flexibility. What do we need? Do we need agility or do we need to slow down? So it kind of takes into account both of these concepts.
I see. So it takes account into the rigidness of certain rules as well, and whether to enforce those rules or whether we reshape this and we make our rules more flexible in a sense. And why is that adaptability, flexibility, and agility important in this world where change is constant?
Yeah, I think it's precisely because change is the only constant. You can't decide based on assumptions. You can't just decide based on past and what worked, because what may present in the future, which is full of change, uncertainty, you've heard the VUCA, volatility, is that stuff that worked in the past may not apply. So adaptability, then adaptive leadership importance becomes of diagnosing the situation first. And by diagnosing, you have to question your assumptions. You have to test and experiment. And that is why managing a future full of change requires that kind of lens.
I see. So since change is the constant, adaptability becomes the future of the constant itself. I see. That is a really wonderful way of thinking about it. And how does this affect team and individual function in the success metric?
Yeah, so if we go back to let's just imagine there's a leader and there's a team, and there's a lot of change happening, there's uncertainty. It's very likely that the people in the team are feeling, anxious. They're feeling worried because they don't know what will happen. They don't know whether the efforts they're making are going to result in the outcomes. And maybe the outcome affects their compensation, their growth, their future. So when people are uncertain, they can feel threatened, they can become defensive, they can withdraw from work. So a good adaptive leader is able to manage these emotions in the team around the change. And they do so because they enable voice from the team itself, from below them. They don't just tell you what to do because one, what to do is not always clear.
Indeed.
So what to do has to be co-created. So when people get a chance to be part of the co-creation, their uncertainty and ambiguity come down a little bit. They have a sense of control. So we know from research that this kind of leadership can actually not just solve problems well, but can also lead to innovations because you just listen more, you stop and reflect, you readjust, and you give people back a little bit of that control.
Sometimes it's also giving autonomy to those people so that they create this solution themselves, and those influences actually also part of being a good leader who is adaptable. And in some of your published works, you've proposed improved measurements approaches for studying employee behavior and teamwork. What have you found on team members and team leaders do to lead adaptively?
Yeah, so just going back to I as an organizational psychologist, I am well trained in psychometrics. And one of the things that always bothers me is organizations or leaders like to make decisions based on data and evidence, right? But to get the data and evidence, you have to measure them, because if you don't measure them, you don't have any data. Now, that measure could be a survey, could be qualitative interviews or past reports. But when we measure what matters, not just what is measurable. Oh, we have this data, so let's just make a decision on this data. That's not going to lead to good leadership decisions. You have to actually think hard about what you measure. So a lot of my work has been trying to improve the measurement. So you asked me how my own research has been shaped by this philosophy. Now, when I was studying teams and I was studying team dynamics, a lot of the research in teams look at the overall level of ideas that get shared, and we call them voice. So how do people speak up in teams? So they compare some teams which have very high voice, high levels, and other teams that have low levels of voice. And then they show how the decision-making performance is impacted. But they also look at how leaders create high level of voice or low level of voice. But if I step back, which I did before we ran the study, but voice is not equally distributed in teams. There's always someone who's speaking a lot more and someone who's silent, So it's not the average level of voice, but it is how it's configured. Now, a good adaptive leadership should be able to control this configuration of voice. Sometimes you need to appoint someone who's the, spokesperson for the team, who collects the data, understands it, or maybe the person who's the best expert in the team, or the person who's just a good listener, a good integrator. Then it's okay for that person to be the key second leader in command. But sometimes you need ideas to be debated. You want everyone to be engaged and voicing. So one of my research shows that the configuration of voice in teams is what impacts how teams reflect on a problem, and it impacts their performance.
I see. So is voice, does voice mean like voicing out your opinion, or
Yes.
is it?
We just say voice. It's not your actual like biological voice. Voice is actually defined as the sharing of ideas, suggestions, and opinions to improve something or to stop doing something.
Ah, okay. So it's giving out your opinion and giving out your thoughts on certain things, and how certain people are more opinionated on the topics and some are more low key and they don't really talk about it as much.
Yeah, but people who are very opinionated can also choose to remain silent and not voice. So it's not opinionated in terms of how stubborn you are about your opinion. The point is, are you sharing? When you say you're voicing, are you sharing? Even if you are unsure about what you need to do, sharing the fact that you're unsure is still voice.
I see. And what practical actions can leaders do to lead adaptively and bringing out these voices into a more harmonious type of voice?
Yeah, I mean, practically, I think it's a long list of things one can recommend. But one of the things about good adaptive leadership is to not jump into solution finding before you've understood the problems. And to understand the problems, you have to be inquisitive and ask a lot of questions and not make assumptions. So it's when a lot of times leaders feel pressured to make a decision and then they just rely on either their intuition, and which is all right. Maybe the intuition says something, but it's just one point of data. They rely on the past. That's just one point of data. There might be some people in your team who are actually closer to the ground and they might have some data. So a good adaptive leadership is someone who adopts like a questioning mindset, you know? So where are we? Why are we here? Where could we be? What is different? What is the same? What is novel? What are parts of the solution I feel I can find a solution? What are parts that I feel are not possible to solve? So those are the things, practical questions a good leader can ask. There are a few other things that I think will help. One is building more of a ritual, a format of having meetings, because so much of the literature and my own work on voice shows that you can't just put people in a room and say, tell me what you think, when the leader has already told you what they think. Because there's likely that they'll agree with you or they will not debate you if they don't feel safe. So creating multiple channels for communication, outsourcing some of the communication where the leader's not in the room, giving it to a peer, maybe having feedback channels like anonymous group chats, or having one-on-one check-ins with people, and then sharing the insights from that one-on-one without naming, without identifying the person. So a lot of those things can build that psychological safety for people to really debate ideas, because without that, you're not going to find a solution to a problem that is new. Yeah.
Yeah, especially usually in the workplace, there are certain prejudice in terms of gender, age, etc., and that this anonymity is actually helping out them voice out more without having to face the prejudice that pre-exist.
Absolutely.
Okay.
And it also gives confidence to others. It just sometimes takes one idea to be expressed for someone to debate it. And what prevents a good leader from anonymously giving ideas on the same channel, right? No one knows it's coming from the leader. If the leader really wants feedback on what they're thinking, they can anonymously put a feedback.
I see.
Right? The whole idea is, are you creating a safe environment in a way that the focus is not on who is saying what and who are they and how important are they. The focus is to get as much of ideas, feedback, debate done before you choose a path.
I see. So it removes the agreeableness of people, especially when it comes from the leaders themselves. And what does it mean to truly redefine success in today's workplace?
So I think the question is very fundamental. I've been thinking a lot about it because, like I said, we end up measuring success based on indicators that are just measurable, in the sense that they have been there, They're either part of the performance review channel or, it's the sales target and how much you made is measurable. So we just use that as a metric of success. I think we need to move away, not away in the sense of stop measuring those things, but go beyond these traditional KPIs. The key performance indicators in a world of change will have to be things like how quickly has the team learned? What is the learning velocity of an individual? How quickly are they able to pick up new knowledge and new skills? Now, that is what is performance in a world of change. If you're looking at a future where change is always going to be constant, what's the response quality of people? Like when they were solutioning, understanding whether they took into account the diversity of ideas, they handled the stakeholders well, that is a good measure of performance. So the point is that if one wants to measure success, both of the leader and the team, one has to start looking at well-being outcomes. Were they innovative? How did that learning velocity and the diversity of debating led to a more innovative capability? Were they collaborating well? So not just looking at whether the solution worked this way, because sometimes the solution works because of external factors and it was a bad solution, but it just happened to work. So then you miss out on measuring the more important things.
How do leaders actually measure these things? Because as you mentioned, these are something that are quite subjective, like creating innovation and be more diverse in terms of creating solutions and all of these other things that are subjective. How can leaders measure that?
Yeah, so I find it, this word, a lot of time people say, oh, it's intangible or it's subjective. Well, it is precisely the job of leaders, organizations, and HR to convert the intangible, important metrics into measurable things. We have so much technology at our disposal today.
Yes.
If leaders want to measure learning velocity, then they need to specify that at the beginning as an important quality in the team. They need to say that what I want to get out of this project is upskilling all of you. And one of the measure of success will be the extent to which each one of you has shown me that you've learned a new capability. And so if one is conscious about what one wants to measure, one can set the metrics in advance. So in research, we call it a pre and a post. When you want to see whether someone has actually changed and performed, you got to measure them where they are, see whatever happens, observe the process, and then measure them at the end to see whether there has been a change. Now, if you get to the end and you ask me, how do I measure all these things? Then you've missed the bus. If you know what you want to measure, you have to set the metrics at the base level. And that is where good planning, thinking, and actually paying attention and not just, saying, oh, these are subjective and not measurable. Honestly, temperature, like I'm going to go as a side, temperature when you feel hot and cold, for the longest time, it is an intangible thing. Feeling hot and feeling cold you can't see it. It's not one physical element, yet we have a thermometer for it. Now, where do you think we came up with a thermometer that could measure something that you cannot observe? It's completely subjective. You can feel hot a different way. I can feel hot a different way. It's not related to any physical object, So yet we have a thermometer. So we can have a thermometer for learning velocity.
I see. So because learning velocity, as you mentioned, is something that's quite intangible, how do one find a baseline? How do one find the zero temperature on this?
Well, that's a really good question. So in a lot of measurement, you may not need to know them as precisely as the Celsius or Fahrenheit zero, like with every degree change.
Yeah, indeed.
What you need to really know is what is your definition of learning velocity first. So I have a couple of papers on team learning. And I've shown in one of this research with my colleagues that when teams go through a hardship, when they go through a big crisis, in this case, they were military teams. So they were teams of soldiers being deployed in, high risk situations with the defense forces. And when they were deployed, they came back and they learned more from each other. And you can measure team learning, as we did in our research study, by asking how much sharing happens, how much upskilling happens, how much of time people are investing in reading, learning, implementing, experimenting. So all of these can be measured initially, either in terms of their skills, knowledge, or in terms of their current level of sharing, learning. And then once you measure it, and they go through this change or a crisis or a new problem they have to solve, how does the team come together to create an experiment and come up with new skills? Could be your measure of how quickly, or it's not just time, how much they have invested in learning.
I see. So,
and how much have they relied only on their past knowledge and divided up the work based on old assumptions? So because what you're doing is, if as a leader you start measuring these things, you're creating a culture where you also tell them that this is important. You're creating a culture of creating a high-performing team for the future, not just for this problem.
I see. So creating a culture where upskilling is the norm. And you've demonstrated that nuanced and theoretically aligned measurements can enhance the predictability of team outcomes and can help organizations identify practical levers to manage both employee and team performance. What measurements should leaders take in terms of finding the balance between adhering to structure and adaptability?
Yeah, I think that's it's a tough question. Because there isn't necessarily one best way. So I'm going to go back for a second and say, there is an answer to the factors you should pay attention to. But at the end of the day, it's a decision a leader has to make, given the context of the problem. So, for example, if you are looking for structure and stability, we know it's better to have structure and stability for things that are more known. So the known knowns, these are things that we know, like, for example, we know that communication is good for collaboration, right? So it's good to have a structure of a higher level of communication. Or we know that when there is an budget overrun, then this is typically what my organization allows me to do. So let's just keep that rigid. Let's not try and change that. That's the constraint of my environment, or that's the known thing. So let's be rigid about those rules. But where can we be flexible, or where can we be more adaptive, is how often do we review our path? When do we adjust our course? How are we going to come back to see whether we have the right skills? Why decide that this one person in the team will do this one thing for the rest of the 6 months? Why fix the job description? Unless fixing the job description is based on the fact that you know that your problem is not going to change, right? So the choice between stability and flexibility, bending, adjusting, adapting, being agile about pivoting, it's dependent on the resources in terms of the skills of the people and the constraints of the problem.
I see. So it's understanding the problems within our organizations as well.
Yes. And it's kind of thinking about what are the sort of the known knowns, solvable problems, and problems for which I don't even know the definition of the problem yet. So if I choose to define it this way, I will have to come back and revisit it. And when I revisit it, I'll have to be flexible about allocation of roles, resources, and that's where the flexibility is required.
I see. So finding out those unknown issues and defining them as certain tangible words so that people can go through it. So for example, like learning velocity, which is actually a word that I actually learned today?
I just made that up. That's not an academic word. You would say learning, because I'm using the word velocity, because I feel like that's important
Yeah, the
in a
speed.
world of change. The speed is important. And the speed also tells us how motivated people are to be early adopters of certain types of things.
I see.
Yeah.
And how can organizations change the metrics for leadership effectiveness?
Well, I think going back to changing the lens, you don't measure success and KPIs based on what is easy to get or what is measurable, right? Or what has been done in your organization. And don't accept that as just the best you can do. At the end of the day, if you want to be successful as an organization and that is your goal, and you're spending such little time defining the metric of success carefully, then you're failing to achieve your goal. It doesn't matter what else you do. If you can't define success for individual workers, for team success, and the success of your leaders, then, and you've defined in your mission and vision statement the success of your organization, how do you think you're going to get there if no one knows how their metric of success is linked to the organizational success? So to be redefining success is to not just define it at the topmost level for the firm, but to go down and say, how does these aspects of the leader's success metrics meet that? Then what are the success metrics of teams and what are the success metrics of individuals? And not just based on their outcome, but based on the process of achieving the outcome.
I see. And what are some challenges in changing these metrics into finding these processes and how these processes work in the workplace?
Yeah, a lot. There are obviously a lot of challenges, which is why it doesn't happen so easy. A lot of what I might be saying might sound very intuitive or may sound like logical, but you'd be surprised, and I'm surprised all the time, how little the performance management systems of companies, how little change happens in them. Even when the context changes, even when the nature of work is changing, the future is uncertain. There's AI, there's differences in people's need, their aging populations, their multiple generations. But performance management systems have been same. We're going to do annual reviews. We're going to do these metrics on meets expectations, exceeds or below expectation. So when you ask what is the main challenge, it's the resistance to revisiting and changing your performance management system. It's resistance for many reasons. One, it's hard. Two, you can be lazy about it. Three, you don't actually understand why it's so important. Fourth, you just don't have a culture quick enough, agile enough to review your policies and practices at the level at which the world is changing. Right? So it's not just individual resistance, it's cultural resistance, it's structural resistance. It's the resistance of leaders to accept that these are flawed, outdated systems, that we should take time. Instead of going on a strategy meeting for 4 days where we discuss the organizational firm strategy of entering a new market, how about investing 5 hours running a workshop on the strategy for changing our performance management system?
I see. So it's more of a structural change as well, not just in terms of the leadership and the performance management systems, but it's a whole company thing.
And sometimes it doesn't have to be whole company. It can be piloted in small areas. But the desire, motivation to try and experiment and to innovate as the nature of work changes should exist. A lot of leaders sit back and reflect on their strategy. They sit back every year to reflect on their budget, resource allocation. How often do they reflect on their employee performance management system?
And as you mentioned, as change is the new constant in this ever-evolving world with AI and new technologies that are coming in every single day, in the future of work, which leadership characteristics would matter more in the workplace for success?
Well, this is my favorite topic these days. I just recently gave a keynote in Bali, in
Ooh.
Indonesia, at a conference on for like an hour and a half on what would be the challenges for leadership in a world of AI. And I think the challenges are enormous. I can touch upon a few things. You asked me what are the characteristics of leaders that will work. One, definitely adaptive leadership, right? It is important because it fundamentally prevents the leader to work on assumptions. Two, the leaders themselves have to have learning velocity. They can't just rely on the traditional ways. Communication is going to matter the same amount. Speed of communication, the volume of communication is going to be high. The need of a human touch is going to go up in a world of AI. But for all the leaders to do that, to do extra of these human things, they have to become digitally fluent in AI. So a lot of my work right now is trying to build a framework on what AI fluency or skill development would mean for leaders. What kind of cultural intelligence they should have, what kind of understanding of human biases they need to have to understand if tomorrow there's an AI agent or an LLM who's a team member or a co-leader with them, how are they going to, assess the output if they don't understand the process, if they have not become fluent in their own ways? So there's a whole lot of things. I can keep going on. This is a topic that I love talking about. I do workshops, I do consulting on this topic. So yeah.
I think you're doing a really wonderful job out there because what you're doing is creating and innovating people's mindset in terms of performance management systems. And not a lot of companies or executives have the ability and adaptability to create and rethink about their whole company's performances in terms of what you were mentioning just now. And can you share a story or example of a time where adaptiveness in leadership led to breakthrough in your organization or someone else's organization that consulted to you?
Yeah, I think that's it's a difficult example to find in one story, but I think the bit I can share from my own personal sort of lived experience is how my, like when you're a PhD student, for example, and you've got 5 years to figure out your research, you go deep into it. These are very long time frame goals. And a lot of organizations have these 5-year goals or 3-year goals. And one tendency that people have in a 5-year, 3-year goals is they spend the first 6 months, 1 year trying to figure out what the issue is, what they need to work on. And then they're like, okay, planning stage done. Now I'm going to get into the action phase. And in the action phase, I'm going to do according to the plan. And then once I've done either the thinking or done the parts of the job, I'm going to start implementing. And the whole fundamental idea of being an adaptive leader is that when you get into the action stage, you end up going to the ground floor, to the dance floor. You're doing stuff and you forget to go onto the balcony to go and look whether it's still relevant to do that stuff. Right? And so a lot of times in real life examples, I've had my own PhD students get stuck in the dance floor when I'm managing a team, or even beyond my PhD student, I was the interim dean for my business school for a while. And people can get stuck in many ways on the dance floor. You come up with an idea, you come up with a plan, you debate it, you come up with ideas. And then when you start doing action, you realize some things are flawed. It's never going to happen. And what it is. But people get wedded into, oh, this is my role. This is my territory. Or I've already done so much work. So they kind of go escalation of commitment. And I feel like when I notice these things as a leader for my own team that I was managing in the business school and for my team of PhD students that I look after and mentor, I feel like helping them stop and reminding them that iterative refinement, that planning stages can come after action, that after implementation, there should be a replanning stage, that it is not all set in stone. So I think that's one of my biggest learning. Sometimes leaders and even I felt a little hesitant to stop and be like, oh, was our plan to start with good enough? Because you have to be humble. You have to say that at the best of my knowledge at the time I made the plan, it was a good plan. But now that I go on the balcony after I've seen everyone dancing on the floor, I don't think that is working. And that humility is what I think, even in my sort of consulting and mentoring and coaching, it's that humility to be able to go away from the dance floor and be like, maybe I need to rethink this.
Okay. So it's having that ability, having that humility to get out of that hyper focus and commitment, the increasing commitment that people have is what's important in today's world of change. And what's one thing leaders can start doing today to embrace adaptiveness and redefine success in their teams?
One thing.
One thing.
One thing is the very difficult one.
Or
if I have
three.
to say,
one or three.
Nah, that's all right.
Okay.
I will try and give you one thing. I think the one thing I would say that summarizes all of this is to think of leadership as an experiment. Okay. So you're always experimenting different influence strategies. You're experimenting how to behave, how to act, how to plan. And why I say think of it as an experiment is because an experiment is defined as learning from systematic trying and feedback to test hypotheses. So if you're a good leader, you must not do things just because it comes out of you. You must do things because you have to have a hypothesis. If you're an experimenter, you can't design an experiment without a hypothesis. So what having a hypothesis helps you as a leader, as an adaptive leader, is it makes you think, if I do this, what is the probability that I'll be able to influence people towards the shared goal? If I do this, when and how will I verify it has worked? If I do this, when will I stop to test the results of my trial to see whether it worked? So if you're an experimenter, rather than a person who knows it all, you're going to be a better adaptive leader.
I see. And going back to our analogy of a musical conductor, it's also the practice of trying out the different things of different practices into having a wonderful orchestra in a concert that plays a harmonious song in the end.
Yep. It definitely doesn't come from one perfect performance.
Indeed. And what practice would you recommend practicing to become a more adaptive leader?
I think it's the mindset. It's definitely the mindset. It's the experimental mindset. It's the ability, it's the humility to accept that one doesn't need to know it all and one doesn't actually know it all. That it's impossible in a future of change and uncertainty and ambiguity. But even though we know that there's the world of AI, there's future of work, nature of work has changed, post-COVID, you still need to have a hypothesis. You still need to say, under these circumstances, if this happens, this could be one way in which our goals will shift. Under these circumstances, if Y happens, I will change. That kind of scientific, probabilistic thinking can really help you set the right milestones to adapt to. And they don't have to be right. They just have to be based on a process that is scientific and data-driven.
I see. Because sometimes as a leader, we think that as we have done a lot of things and people have a lot of successes in their lives, they would have these thoughts where, okay, this is rigid and this is true and tested. How can one change that mindset and become a more adaptive leader in the future?
I think is honestly the best way to change that mindset is to accept that if you feel you know it all, then that itself is going to be the biggest flaw as a leader. Because one, the I know it all, I've done this, I'm so successful, I know how this industry works, I always know what's the right thing to do, is going to be a self-statement that's going to get you into trouble. And I'm not saying that people who believe that are all narcissists. Sometimes it's overblown self-confidence, right? So it's a very thin line. You can be confident about your area of expertise, but then to overextend that expertise or to become, I know I am just a good thinker, that is just humanly not possible. We are prone to biases. We are prone to overconfidence, confirmation bias. So as a good leader, if you want to become an experimenter or a scientist goes into a problem saying, I don't know what the solution will be. I don't know whether the process will even lead to the solution, but I want to systematically try measuring things, testing my hypotheses based on what I know from the past. And then I will let data speak rather than have confidence that my hypothesis is correct.
I see. So it's more to finding that self-awareness and the journey of that self-awareness to find out that, okay, I think we need to take a step back to know that I actually don't know a lot of things, that we need to reevaluate a lot of things. Okay, that's really wonderful. And I think that's a really good closing to our topic. And now we can move on to our next segment where we have an open mic and you have the chance to talk about anything that you're passionate about, and it doesn't have to be related to the topic, and the stage is yours.
Oh, well, thank you. I do want to tell the listeners that there is a little puppy sitting in my lap. And that's because one of the things I'm passionate of is dogs. So there's one behind me and there's one here. But I sure can talk about this with a puppy in my hand because this is something I'm very passionate about. So one of the things that I've really been thinking hard about is how's the nature of work going to change with the introduction of not just the AI that we have today, which is all the large language models and, the GPTs that can analyze text and write reports and the DeepSeek that got released a couple of weeks ago. But it's also the agents that are going to come. And these agents are going to be either narrow experts. They could be working alongside us, like maybe the financial data analysts or marketing analysts or an HR analyst who's going to be part of a team of humans. And in the future, there might even be a generally intelligent agent who could be in the form of a robot, or it could be in the form of a computer screen. One has to imagine these futures and then think about what will be the nature of teamwork. How are we going to debate ideas? Because this agent, robot, intelligent being is going to say something, and they're going to say it with 99% accuracy. And we know that they have that rate of accuracy, but we have no way to understand it. We can't go into its algorithm. It's too complicated with billions of parameters. They may give you an explanation, but we know that explanation is not really true because it doesn't capture the 1 billion parameters. So how are we going to trust them? Are we going to always trust them more than we trust ourselves? And what if we want to debate them? And we want to say, okay, you're 99.9% accurate. This is the financial projection, but I have some ethical concerns. Now, that AI agent may not have the ability to debate ethical concerns. So for me, a lot of these questions means we need to have different frameworks of managing teams. Leaders will have to become more aware of ethical frameworks. They will have to become more aware of it's not just about getting the right answer. It's about being comfortable with all multiple implications of that right answer. And that's why I think the leadership will have to be in not just getting outputs from people, but evaluating the outputs using many other parameters of societal good, organizational good, individual well-being,
I see.
And so forth. So yeah, I'm very passionate. I'm preparing a whole course on a topic like this. I am doing some research, developing some knowledge graphs with some other AI specialists to help leaders. And finally, I'm developing a whole scale to measure what would be the literacy, digital AI literacy skill for leaders to be able to do this kind of teamwork.
Yeah. Wonderful work, Ruchi, because that's something that's actually quite important to the future and how we set the parameter of how things are changing and the performance management systems. And thank you, Ruchi, for joining us and giving us such insights with adorable puppies behind you.
I'm glad they got some time of fame. Yeah.
And
thank you again.
You're welcome. And if our listeners want to find out more about you and your work, where can they go?
So I do have a website, which is very simple. It's ruchisinha.com, which has a whole host of things. You can get in touch with me, whether it's consulting, working, coaching. So yeah, that's the best way. Otherwise, I'm also on LinkedIn. If you search for Ruchi Sinha at Nanyang Business School, you should be able to find me. I'm more than happy if you want to add me on LinkedIn.
Okay, thank you very much, Ruchi. I'll go ahead and add you on LinkedIn after this. And thank you everyone for tuning in, and we'll catch you in the next episode. See you later.
You've been listening to Wealth Pathways, the Affluence Science Insights Podcast produced by LMSL, the Life Management Science Labs. More episodes are available from 10 life management perspectives and can be found by searching LMSL on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, and other podcasting apps available on your devices. If you enjoyed this episode, please rate, share, and subscribe to our channel so that other people can find it and we can continue to provide quality content. More of our work can be found on our website at affluence.lifemanagementsciencelabs.com, where you can join our movement. I'm Marie Stella. Thanks for tuning in.